a country legal and regulatory framework as one of the key factors to invest in a country. In 2023, Uzbekistan attracted foreign investments over 2.5 billion and has a very ambitious plan to attract foreign investments by more than 110 US billion by 2030 as a part of the Uzbekistan 2030 strategy. So having a good, proper legal and regulatory framework is very important for investor-friendly environment. So what conditions on the new law on investments are there, and how will they affect attracting foreign direct investments? We will hear today from a esteemed panel of speakers. Let me maybe start first with Golib, who is the Secretary of the Foreign Investor Council under the President, who is basically, we can say, a voice of the private sector, to give us, given the prominent role that Foreign Investor Council plays in the country, can you tell us what is the opinion of the Foreign Investor Council members and investors on the proposed draft investment law? And please keep the answers maybe 4 or 5 minute stops, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. So just going back to answer your question, in general, as you know, human nature doesn't like change. So investors also don't like too many changes. So in this case, I think it would be an exception because the law was changed. The current investment law was adopted a couple of years ago, 3-4 years ago. And then there were some issues there. And now the revised version, and thanks to IFC and other IFIs, the law has been revised. And the current version is relatively, I think I would say, the reception from the investment community was positive. And so nevertheless, there were, we had several working groups with this related to this subject. And of course, from their perspective, it's not only the law, but also its implementation, right? So it's so I think the challenge is that there are many in Uzbekistan. We have Ministry of Investments, and we also have, and for some reason, there's a kind of understanding that that's the only entity that's responsible for investment climate improvement. But when in reality, all the other ministries and government entities are also responsible. For example, labor law. We have some issues with labor law. The Ministry of Investment cannot do by itself anything by itself. So I think in general the reception is quite positive. So top 3 changes are into this law are, so one is focus on private investors. So it's FDI focus and more promotion of private investments while excluding public investments. That was the issue with the current law. And of course, second, the most important is investor protection. So, and which equal treatment of and full protection and security of all investors, whether they are local or foreign. And last but not least, it's international arbitration. Of course, there are many other nuances, but I just wanted to highlight these 3. So, granting investors access to domestic and international dispute settlement procedures. So, I think in general, of course, the law is still in process. It's, as I know, it's the latest news is it's Ministry of Justice. But I think it's now well drafted. We have received all the comments from IFIs, from ministries, and from our investors. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thanks, Golib. And I think it's important to highlight the 3 kind of key elements that the private sector sees as important. But let's maybe go a bit more into details on the technical legal aspects of the law. And let me give a floor to Anton Konov, who is a corporate partner at Allen & Overy. To basically, can you share with us the challenges of the current law, that in existence, in the contrast with the advantages of the new draft, and that what is that the new draft can bring in terms of international standards for investor protection, ensuring what we've heard, favor and equitable treatment, national treatment, so the good practice or good global practices in terms of investor protection. Anton, over to you. And
yeah,
4 to 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Tarek. I think I probably should start answering the question with making one step back and just to say that, and I think it's important that Uzbekistan does have investment protection legislation in place already. Yeah? So, and it had it for a number of years. Specifically in 2019, there was a law adopted which is currently in force. It's actually quite a lengthy law, though length not necessarily means good law, but it is actually not a bad law. And that's important because it is not something that the government is doing new in terms of introducing the concept of protection or guarantees of the investors. In fact, there is already a fairly good regime in place. Now, the purpose of the new law is to enhance these protections, to make them more structured, institutionalize them, and make them more consistent both with international standards and probably more importantly with the expectations of the foreign investors, yeah? And, you know, when we specifically talk about the guarantees, then most of the guarantees that we now see in the new draft law, they also appear in the old law. But the beauty or the advantage of the new law is that these guarantees are set out in a very structured way. You know, they're not only just listed, but they are defined. So you mentioned fair and equitable treatment, yeah? So this concept, these words, they don't exist in many jurisdictions, including in the countries in Central Asia, because they follow the civil law concept. However, the new law not only just say that this is the protection the investors are getting, but what it also does say, it does explain what this concept of fair and equitable treatment is. And that's super important for a country whose both legal and judicial system is developing. And when we turn to other guarantees, other protections, we see the same thing. So altogether, there is a whole chapter in the new law which lists about 13, I think, guarantees, all of which are very clearly defined, understandable. And if you take the best practices of all the laws which exists in Europe and elsewhere, you will see that they broadly follow the same standard of protection and of the guarantees.
Thanks a lot. And I think it's very important. We've heard what investors like and what they think is good in the law, but then the way you explain that the current draft does provide these reassurances, and it's more transparent and in a more consistent manner, which is important for the country that wants to attract massive amount of foreign direct investments. Moving forward, I would like to ask someone who has extensive experience as both as a senior advisor at Potomac Global Partners, but also former US ambassador to ADB, Ambassador Chang. From your extensive experience in working with large corporates and investors, how will foreign companies, having heard what we've heard, how will they, including Chamber of Commerce or nations that are doing trading with Uzbekistan, how will they view this investment law, and why do you think their opinion is important?
It's actually very simply said, it's a very positive step. I can probably leave my answer there, but if you want me to expand, I will. So when external actors, they look at this law, it provides them with the assurances, as previously discussed. It allows them to see that the government is providing avenues of transparency, of the governance, in order to alleviate any type of concerns that when they invest their money, it's done in a way that gives them the ability to get what they want from the government, from local, provincial, and the national government. What it also does is it allows them to see that they can invest in localities where there's a vibrant workforce, where it provides them with, you know, the type of assurances that one would need if they're going to make sizable investments, simply put.
Thanks. So basically, it provides them with security, with reassurances, which is very important. And we've heard these words few times. And I would like to move slowly to a slightly different topic that Golib mentioned, and that is the focus of the law between the public and the private investments. And I would like to ask Thomas Emmanuel Dance, who was his international investment and policy consultant, but also former US Treasury International Affairs. From your experience, how important is focusing investment law on foreign direct investments and private investments versus public investments, which is the case of the current law?
Salam alaikum. Добрый день. Спасибо. Rahman.
Good evening.
Good question. I guess just by way of background, so I was most recently in the Trump administration. I was at U.S. Treasury in international affairs. But prior to that, I spent about 3 decades investing with direct investment and venture capital in a lot of countries here, in Russia, in Kazakhstan, in Moldova, in Ukraine, Azerbaijan, even Afghanistan. I did not invest in Uzbekistan. So very interesting to be here. I would say from a private venture kind of direct investing mentality, it's very different than the corporate mentality. That is not to say that an investment law is not important for us, but basically we're moving more quickly and in front of corporate investors. And so the number one thing that we look at when we invest in a country is fairly basic. How are we going to get our money back? Right? It's no good to be investing if you can't ever get your money out. So then before we ever invest, we focus on what we would call multiple and redundant exit strategies. Right? That's our number one concern. We expect to be treated fairly. We hope to be, but we know going in, we're not going to necessarily. There's going to be a give and take. There's going to be a rough ride. We have more than just to worry about our relationships with the government and how we function under a legal structure. We have the whole business case to focus, right? So our point of view is good to have the law, very good to have it as a safeguard. It gives comfort to the people who we want to sell to. Right, so when we came, so I'll tell you. So I went to Moscow Energy Institute, right, and back in the Soviet days. I was fortunate to come visit your country when it was still in the Soviet Union. I spent a few weeks here. 1995, I started investing in Russia and the former Soviet Union. We started some companies, one that became the largest brewing company in Russia. We bought up quickly 6 breweries and put them together with an Indian co-investor. But in that case, if we had waited for the whole picture to develop, we would have never made the deal, right? Same with, we started a bottled water company that became St. Springs Water, Svyaтой Istochnik. It became the biggest water company in Russia. We sold it to Nestle. Again, this was, there were no guarantees at that point. It was moving quickly, it was taking risks. The 1 and 2 most important factors, the business opportunity, was there a market there? Could we make a decent return on our money? Could it be executed? Was there growth ahead of it? And secondly, who are the people? Who is the management team we're investing with? Who are our partners, right? Those are the fundamentals. You can have the most beautiful law in the world, but if you're wrong on either one of those 2 upfront considerations, it's going to go wrong for you. And having to fall back on an investment law after you've misfired on one of the 2, you know, that's not what we're in it for. That's not our business. That's basically meaning that you've almost lost. And I hope that doesn't sound glib, but we realize that deals are not going to work. Definitionally, we're in a risk-taking business. Some of them may not work because of relations with an investment law. Some of them may not work because the market moved against us. That's what the risks that you take on. That's what your investors are paying you for.
Thanks. And I think, you know, for those of you who are familiar with the private equity venture capital, I mean, this is a higher risk reward game, and you are entering the risky markets, but even there, you're still looking for exit strategy, for security, and as we've heard this morning at the plenary session, skills and people, which is very, very important. Moving back to some of the different types of investment agreements and protection that can be given to investor, let me move to Mikhail Turecki, who is partner and co-manager of Latham & Watkins, and basically ask him if you could share with us your kind of views on the challenges of the current law in contrast to the new draft, but specifically looking at PSAs and investment agreements, and how do you think this can play a role in attracting investors going forward?
Thank you very much, Tarek. My name is Mikhail Turecki. I'm a partner at a law firm called Latham & Watkins. I'm based in the London office. Prior to that, I used to be head of our Moscow office for the last 10 years. We act a lot for governments in the region on various issues, including most recently protection of governments in investment disputes. So we can see the practical side of this discussion. So when investments go wrong, investors file lawsuits and claims against the host governments, claiming the damages resulting from failed investments or investments that gone wrong. So in that sense, we can see, for us, it's not only a theoretical discussion, but also a practical discussion of what the government needs to do to make sure they have a civilized process for resolving any subsequent disputes, and they don't have any unpleasant surprises afterwards. So to Tarek's question, we analyzed the current framework. The main issue with it is that it's spread across various laws. So the production sharing agreements are governed by the law from 2001. PPPs are governed from a law from 2019. And we need to go to various pieces of legislation to collate the full picture. So the first advantage of the new law is consolidating all of those requirements and all of those procedures in a single document. And there's also an interesting section in the new law which says that the new law prevails over other inconsistent laws. And it's a good provision to have, in the sense that the investors can expect that what they read in the investment law would take precedence over any different provisions in other laws. But it's also a bit risky because the lines can be blurred. So the question is, does the investment law prevail over the entire body of Uzbekistan legislation, or it prevails over specific provisions relating to investments? So it can be a difficult analysis which specific provisions this law prevails over and which it doesn't. So it would be really important to make sure that not only you adopt the new investments law, but also you make any relevant amendments to existing laws. We understand the amendments are being proposed. We haven't seen the draft of the amendments to the other laws, but we hope that the entire body of the law related to investments will be aligned. And another advantage of the new law is that there will be effectively a single window or a one-stop shop for investors in the Ministry of Investments. So MIIT will be the authorized body for all of those investments, and the investors will know which particular set of officials they need to deal with. It's good that the new law will have incentives and mechanism for settlements of investment disputes. We looked at the provisions and they seem to be generally consistent with international standards and practices in terms of dispute resolution. There's also standardization. There are definitions for investment deal. There are definitions for state support provisions. So we think that it's definitely a step forward, and there are a lot of specific advantages in the new law if it is adopted.
Thanks a lot. And I think it's reassuring to hear from esteemed law firm doing the analysis what are kind of the benefits of the law and how it compares to the global practices. But let me pick up on one point you mentioned, which is the single point of contact or one-stop shop. And I know I'm going back now to Golub because I'm sure as a foreign investor counsel who talks to investors all the time, I'm sure you've heard stories, and I can say from my experience in many countries around the world, one of the issues that investors face is working with multiple agencies, multiple government bodies, implementation on the ground. From your experience, Golub, and experience of the members, how, what do you think and how much of the impact the kind of the single window will have on investors? How do investors see this?
Thank you. So from my experience, I think, and also from the experience of foreign investors, the members of the Foreign Investors Council, I can tell you that a single window would significantly increase the convenience for investors to invest in Uzbekistan. For example, I can give you an example. When the Agency for Development of PPP was closed down, a lot of investors didn't know where to go, basically. Because it was under the Ministry of Finance, but nevertheless, Ministry of Finance is not specialized to deal with investors. So whereas there was an agency which was specialized for PPPs and was dealing with the investors with the pipeline of projects on a continuous basis. And during that time, I was working at Foreign Investors Council, and they kind of addressed to me. They questioned to me. They came to me, and I was a little bit. I think it was not. How should I say? It was not really good from the perspective of a government entity to see investors in going back and forth and requiring some information and not able to communicate with government agencies properly. So I think centralized entry points such as single window would be really convenient for them, and I think Ministry of Investments not overtaking the whole PPP mandate, but just the coordination part, just a central entry point for all investors, whether public or private, if they on just the coordination part, because the Ministry of Investment doesn't have the capacity to work with PPP projects. So that would be really, I think, so currently there is no such system, and it would really, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of all the members, it would increase investors' interest into Uzbekistan and make it more convenient. Thank you.
Thanks. Ambassador Cheng, you have extensive experience, and since we are talking about investor servicing, aftercare, kind of government support services, from your experience, what do you think and how important are the aftercare services or government support after initial investments are made? How important is that for the investors when they are considering investments?
So, as the previous speaker said, I think this corresponds with a single point of entry because it allows for, from a government perspective, it allows for one voice speaking to the investor as well as the investor speaking to one single point of entry. So I think it's somewhat what we call a two-way street. So as long as constant communication happens, it provides assurances that investors, corporates, or venture capital types that whatever issues that they have can be addressed, hopefully in a quick and expedited manner. I think one thing that governments need to consider is, especially with a new law, is how the law is implemented, which government agencies are involved. Is there coordination and collaboration between different ministries, whether it's the Ministry of Justice, Finance Ministry, Ministry of Investments, that the investor has enough assurances that if they go to the Ministry of Investment, that they will in fact talk to the other ministries that will have input and can affect the investor and what they bring into this country. So whether it's labor issues, there's a whole host of issues which is investment law can help with. But there are labor issues, there's tax provisions, and other types of legal ramifications that when corporates or investors come in, that they want to be able to get these types of assurances or these issues addressed. So that needs to have taken place, or needs to take place with the single window point of entry as well.
Perfect, thanks. And then Going back to Mikhail, since we are still talking about this investor protection and investor servicing, in the proposed, considering the current law, and there is an Article 63 saying there is an exhaustion of local remedies limitations. So what kind of benefits or advantages you see in the new draft law that they might bring in terms of the granting investors the choice of kind of dispute settlement, whether under domestic or international regulation? So how do you see that from the legal perspective? Because your clients are corporates and they advise you on kind of your legal advice when considering investing.
So when we look at the current law, indeed, so Article 63 of the current law, it contained a requirement to exhaust all local remedies, so go through the local courts in Uzbekistan up until the highest instance, and only then investors can bring arbitration. This is less preferable for investors because they need to spend a lot of time in the local legal system, and presumably they would be skeptical about their ability to achieve much in the local legal system when they go against the government. So they would want to go into the international procedure as soon as possible, and the current law would delay them considerably. So we understand that the idea is to offer better terms to the investors in the new law. So we see that there's a new Article 29 in the new law, which it effectively deviates from requirements to exhaust all local remedies, and instead there's a cooling off period of 180 days. So it gives the investors the certainty that if they can't resolve their dispute within 180 days, they would be able to pursue international arbitration or another international settlement procedure. So this would likely be viewed favorably by international investors. That may likely be viewed unfavorably by local by other ministries, other than the Ministry of Investments. Maybe Ministry of Justice would have a view on this as well. But for the investors, that's helpful. We think that Article 29 could be tweaked a little bit further. There is a kind of global practice for this fork in the road clauses, so-called, that could be improved a little bit more in line with international practice, but it's definitely a step in the right direction, and it helps the international investors. There's an interesting provisions in the new law that essentially one thing to remember is that Uzbekistan is free to make new laws, but Uzbekistan is also party to a number of international treaties, multilateral and bilateral, and obviously those treaties will prevail in case of any inconsistencies. So the new law says that if there is deviation between the provisions of the new law and the provisions of the bilateral and multilateral treaties, investor gets the better deal. So if there's better treatment under the new law, investors get the better treatment. If there's better treatment under bilateral treaties, investors get better treatment under the get treated under the treaties. So that's also helpful. Effectively, it gives the investors the best of both worlds. So in that regard as well, we think it's a step in the right direction and should encourage international investors.
Thanks a lot. And then I think it's important that, we basically heard that provisions of the new draft are a step in the right direction and provide a lot more assurances, clarity, transparency, and predictability to investors. There is one thing that in Uzbekistan, but also in other Central Asian countries, there is a tendency to sign investment agreements by many different government agencies and institutions. So going to Anton, the current law basically allows the public ministries, bodies who are working on promoting investments to sign investment agreements. So there can be multiple of them signing any form of investment agreement. while the new draft proposed a single authorized body, which basically kind of streamlined. So, I mean, maybe can you just share from your views what are some of the risks with one approach or the other? How would you kind of see that?
Thank you, Tarek. Well, I think partially this question is connected to an earlier question whether there should be one single authorized body for all sorts of purposes, including promoting protection of investments, or there could be multiple bodies participating in the project. I mean, personally, just to make one step back, I would say I don't think there is a right or wrong answer to that question, though your question is slightly different. I'll come to that in a second. I mean, I personally think that it is possible to have multiple bodies in charge of the process insofar as you have a system which coordinates them extremely well, which is a difficult task. But sometimes, in some countries, it can be justified. You know, for example, if Uzbekistan was a federation, I mean, a country like the United States where each state has lots of sovereignty and its own separate legal effectively system, you know, you can go down that route because there would be arguments in that favor. And there are also arguments in favor of, you know, having separate bodies in charge because each of them have their own expertise and focus, and there could be some efficiency. But personally, in case of Uzbekistan, I would also agree that the idea of having one single body which is in charge of that process is a better solution. Now, coming to your question, the signing kind of investment agreements is actually a more legal question. And there I would be probably more direct in saying that one authorized body is better. Because I think what you don't want is to create at least legal inconsistencies in having different investment agreements following different standards, different interpretation appearing in your legal system. It is not good for the investors because they, you know, experience different practice, different application of law, but it is also not great for the state as well, because one of the main problems, including legal problem, is that this could be the cause of various disputes, including legal disputes. So the idea of having one single signing body, so to say, is, I think, definitely the right one.
Perfect. And I think I have, there is one topic we haven't touched, but given the nature of it, it's something that is definitely important for investors, and that's expropriation. So going back to Thomas, I think from your experience, extensive experience, again, private equity, venture capital is more risky, we know that, but you also have a lot of experience with corporates. How important is that investors get the protection against both direct and indirect expropriation with compensation? How do you think that's important when you make a decision to invest?
Again, to just frame it from the perspective of a direct investor versus a corporate investor, strategic investor, I think it's different. It depends on your horizon. Again, expropriation is the worst case scenario, right, for your deal. Deals can bust for any reason, but getting something taken away from you basically means game over in that country. You're leaving from the point of view of a financial investor. Your time is too valuable. The worst thing you can be doing as a direct investor is spending your time fighting, right, in court. At that point, you are not making money. You are only trying to cut your losses, right? So it goes back to how you spend your time up front, right? We don't actually, and I hate to, again, I don't want to be glib about this, it's real. Expropriation, in my history in 30 years, yeah, I've invested in Russia before, right? Now it's not a great time to be invested in Russia. It's a difficult time, unfortunately. We have some major challenges geopolitically. But had we, at that point in time, given consideration to expropriation? No. The answer was no, because that is one of what I would call the attendant risks of investing in an emerging market. You either are embracing those up front or you stay home, frankly. So there is, of course, insurance you can buy from it, and our government provides that opportunity. You can buy it through a group called DFC. You can buy it through the World Bank has an operation. You can buy it through Lloyd's. You can buy it through AIG. It's not cheap. You know, it's going to cost you premiums of about 1% a year, right? That adds up, right? Especially if it's a successful deal, you're looking at it going, well, why am I, 1% off? Especially in a tight environment, right? So the answer is basically helpful, and I guess the other part is actually making a claim against a policy is a time-consuming exercise. And with all due respect to the attorneys in the room, I've paid a lot of attorneys. Our funds have paid a lot of attorneys. It's a good living, but our goal is not to pay attorneys for a 10-year stretch to try and recover money, or a 5-year stretch under a policy again. We want to be putting money to work. We want to be doing successful deals. We want to be getting money back. We want to be reinvesting that money. That flow is what we're focused on. Anything that takes you away from that, you're missing the game.
Thanks. And I think in my experience of doing panels, and I've done many of them, I think this was one of the most efficient panel with esteemed guests. So we have a time for one quick final comment. If you have any final comment, just a quick one remark, maybe 1 minute. I will start with Golib, from the representative of the Foreign Investor Council. Final quick comment, anything that you want to wrap up with.
Thank you. So I think the most important thing when drafting a law, I think we should focus from the investor's perspective. Uzbekistan has for now, I think 7 years, has been actively promoting investors. Now I think we could shift slowly into protection of investors. I think supporting and protection, it would be more important from my perspective, and I think from the investor's perspective as well. And that's what actually the law is doing. And I think, yeah, but let's see. I mean, initially when we drafted PPP law, I was the director of PPP Development Agency. And when we adopted new law, we simultaneously started testing it. And within, I think, 1 year or 6 months, we prepared amendments and amended it. Because it's not, of course, Uzbekistan is competing with probably 20, 30 countries, right? So the law is just only one part. You have legal, strong legal, but then you need to have strong institutions. So we shouldn't keep forgetting about that. I mean, I think our colleagues also mentioned about that. So we should also focus on strengthening capacity institutions and look at holistically, make sure that the agencies cooperate, and the communication and predictability of government should be also in place. Thank you.
Thanks. Mikhail, final comment from your side. Anything you want to wrap up with?
I think, yeah, once again, it's a step in the right direction. We hope that the law will be adopted soon. The amendments to the other laws will follow even sooner, and you'll be all set.
Thanks. Ambassador Chang?
I think the law, anytime you create a law to protect investors, I think is a good thing. But one thing that also needs to be considered is downstream effect of a law like this. What does it mean for consumers? What does it mean for a local population where investors might be investing? And so downstream effect, but also you got to look at the effects of a law like this holistically to ensure that the local population is protected from certain outcomes that might be unfavorable as well.
Thanks. Thomas?
I would say, just from my perspective, I'm really glad I came. I had a great trip around Uzbekistan. First time in 34 years. I was able to get out to Fergana Valley and see things. For an investor, what we want is we want to be early. We don't want to be in a room with a bunch of other investors and fighting over things. We want to get in here, see what the opportunities are, and then move ahead, right? So I like what I see. 7 years into this, hey, look, investor protection is a journey. It's not a destination. There is no finish line here. But the most important thing about the law, actually, in my point of view, is not so much what it says on paper, it's what it says to the outside world. It says, we want to meet you fairly, we want to do things better. We realize we have improvement to make, so we want to work with you. And that's what we have to come to this country with the same spirit. We want to work with you. The part of the government, a lot of these disputes happen because, and our side, meaning the investor side, is equally, we need to understand what the government's needs are, or the dispute party in this, and work to avoid those on the upfront. So a lot more time in country, a lot more time building relationships, building trust, and assessing the opportunities are the key things. It's good to have the law, it's moving in the right direction, but again, think about it in terms of decades here, right? This is going to be a iterative process. Thank you.
Thanks. And over the past few years, Uzbekistan did make also some strides into increasing venture capital, private equity, which started from very low base, but it's picking up. So the whole region is still nascent, but it's kind of picking up. So that can be one of the stories of the Uzbekistan growth. Anton.
Yes. What I was going to say is that there are a number actually of studies about correlation between the quality of the investment protection legislation and the investments. And interestingly, maybe for someone surprisingly, most of the studies say that there is little to no correlation, in that the good law doesn't necessarily mean it's a good investment climate and there are lots of investments. I mean, the bad law probably does mean it, but the good law, and many countries have good laws. Many of them follow model laws. They're designed well. The proposed draft is great. I mean, it's just good. I mean, it's difficult to criticize it. I mean, you may disagree with something, but in principle, it is very good law. It follows, as we discussed, best standards. It is what the investors generally expect. And it's very great to see generally how Uzbekistan makes great progress in terms of developing its own investment legislation and other legislation which aim to protect investors. However, I think what is important is the next step. Yeah, as Mikhail mentioned, the new laws need to be implemented, the other legislation need to change, but even that is probably kind of not the first thing. The first thing is how this law is going to be really applied, how it's going to be interpreted, and how it's going to be implemented. And that's super critical.
Thanks. So I think, again, my esteemed panelists were very, very good. And I, in my career, haven't seen an esteemed panel that would really stick into the guidelines of, limiting the interactions, which is amazing. But what was very important is, I think we all heard that the new draft law is good. It's very good. Where I second every single statement here is, it's not what's on the paper, but how it gets implemented. And I worked in more than 40 countries around the world. The biggest problem is how things get done on the local level. You can have a great laws on paper, but how they get implemented. And that's, I think, where also what His Excellency President was talking this morning.
hurmatli prezidentimiz ham erta aytib
did a very good job in
qilib bu qonunni amalga oshirdi.
And I think draft is a very
подготовке законопроекта. Мы двигаемся в правильном направлении.
kind of sends a signal we are open for business. And this is a new step, next step forward. But it's up to all of us and all the ministries and in rayons, in Akimats, how to implement the law. And that's whether it will make it or break it. That's, I think, the big difference, how you implement the law. Because I think, as we heard, investor disputes, they don't start because the law is maybe not clear. Sometimes they do, but it's all about how different people interpret the law. So with that, I would like a round of applause for the panelists and then maybe picture taking.